The bullet that killed Thomas Whitfield's father was still lodged somewhere in the floorboards of the old grain mill, and every time he rode into Cedar Hollow, he swore he could still smell the gunpowder from that terrible night 3 years past. Today, he told himself, was just another trip for grain. He never could have imagined he was about to ride home with a woman who would heal a wound he thought would never close. If you believe in kindness, faith, redemption, and second chances, take a moment now to like, comment, share, and subscribe, because this story is about to remind you why those things still matter, even in the hardest corners of the world. The Wyoming sun hung low and merciless over the dusty road leading into Cedar Hollow, a modest frontier town wedged between rolling prairie and the distant blue shoulders of the mountains. Thomas Whitfield rode his weary gray mare, Dust, past the weathered fence posts and into the heart of town, his hat pulled low against the wind that always seemed to carry the scent of sage and old sorrow. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered from years of ranch work, but there was a heaviness in his eyes that no amount of sun could burn away. His father had been a respected rancher once, before outlaws raided their homestead and left him dead in the dirt, leaving Thomas alone to manage 300 acres of land that had once been a family's pride and was now a lonely burden. The town itself was unremarkable by most standards: a sheriff's office with peeling paint, a saloon that rattled with piano music most evenings, a general store, and the grain mill that had become Thomas's most frequent destination. He needed feed for the cattle, seed for the spring planting, and an excuse, if he was honest with himself, to be around other living souls for even an hour. Loneliness had settled into his bones the way frost settles into late autumn ground, and he had grown so accustomed to silence that he sometimes forgot the sound of his own laughter. He tied Dust to the post outside Hendrick's Grain and Feed and stepped up onto the wooden boardwalk, the heels of his boots echoing against the planks. Old man Hendricks greeted him with a nod, the kind of nod two men share when words feel unnecessary. "Got your order ready, Whitfield," the old man said, gesturing toward the back where sacks of grain sat stacked like a small fortress. "Take you a minute to load up. Why don't you stretch your legs and grab a coffee at the boarding house while I get the wagon hitched proper?" Thomas agreed, more out of habit than desire, and made his way toward the small boarding house at the edge of town, where Widow Carter served coffee strong enough to wake the dead-end biscuits that reminded folks of better days. It was there, stepping through the doorway with the bell above it jingling softly, that Thomas first saw her. She stood near the window, a letter trembling slightly in her hands, her dark traveling dress dusted from days on the stagecoach trail. Her hair was the color of autumn wheat, pulled back simply, and her eyes, when she finally looked up and met his gaze, held something Thomas recognized instantly because he carried the very same thing himself: grief wrapped tightly in quiet dignity. Her name, he would soon learn, was Sarah Jane Marlowe, and she had traveled from St. Louis by stagecoach and rail to become a mail-order bride for a rancher named Elias Crow, a man twice her age who had written her letters full of promises about a fine house and a gentle life. But Elias Crow was nowhere to be found. Widow Carter explained the situation with the weary patience of a woman who had seen many strange arrivals in her boarding house over the years. Crow had sent word just 2 days prior that he'd changed his mind, married a local widow instead, and saw no need to trouble himself further with explanations to a woman he'd never even met. Sarah Jane had nowhere to go, no family waiting, and barely enough money for a return ticket east, a place she had left behind for reasons she did not yet share with anyone, least of all a stranger. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, something he hadn't felt since before his father died. He approached her slowly, removing his hat the way his mother had taught him as a boy, and introduced himself with a voice gentler than he'd used in longer than he could remember. Sarah Jane looked at him with cautious eyes, the kind that had learned not to trust kindness too quickly, for kindness in her experience had often come with hidden costs. She told him, with trembling pride, that she did not need pity, that she would find her own way, that she had survived worse than abandonment in a dusty Wyoming town. But Thomas Whitfield was not offering pity. He was offering something he hadn't realized he still possessed: hope. He sat with her for nearly an hour, the coffee growing cold between them, as she spoke in careful fragments about her life back in St. Louis. A father who drank away the family's modest savings, a mother who died of fever when Sarah Jane was only 16, and a series of difficult years working as a seamstress to survive in a city that offered little mercy to women alone. She had answered the mail-order advertisement, not out of romantic dreams, but out of desperate necessity, believing that even a stranger's ranch in the Wyoming territory might offer more safety than the streets of a city that had never been kind to her. Thomas listened with the same quiet attention he gave to a wounded animal, understanding instinctively that any sudden movement might frighten her away entirely. When Hendricks finally sent word that the wagon was loaded, Thomas found himself standing at a crossroads more significant than any cattle trail he'd ever ridden. He could load his grain, ride home to his empty ranch house, and let Sarah Jane Marlowe fade into memory as another stranger passing through Cedar Hollow. Or he could do something his careful, grief-hardened heart hadn't dared attempt in years. He could take a chance on kindness. He offered her work, not marriage, not yet, not under false pretenses. He explained that his ranch house had stood half empty since his mother passed years before his father, that he needed someone to manage the household, that he could pay her fair wages and offer her safety and respectability under a roof that, while modest, was honestly his own. Sarah Jane studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the deception she had learned to expect from men, and found instead only the steady, sun-weathered honesty of a man who had buried too much grief to bother with lies. She accepted, though pride made her insist on proper wages and proper boundaries, and Thomas respected her terms without argument. Widow Carter, watching the exchange with a knowing smile, packed Sarah Jane's single traveling case onto the wagon herself, whispering a blessing under her breath as the two strangers rode out of Cedar Hollow together beneath a sky burning orange with the colors of sunset. The ranch, when they arrived, sat quiet and lonesome against the darkening prairie, the house showing all the neglect of a man who had stopped believing anyone would ever fill it with warmth again. Sarah Jane said nothing of the dust on the windowsills or the cobwebs gathering in corners, but Thomas saw her taking inventory with the practiced eye of a woman who had learned survival through hard work. Within days, the house began to transform, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of care that spoke louder than words. Curtains were washed and hung. Bread rose warm on the stove each morning. The garden, long abandoned, began sprouting green shoots beneath her careful hands. Thomas found himself returning from the cattle fields earlier each evening, drawn not by duty, but by something warmer. The sound of Sarah Jane humming softly while she worked, the smell of supper cooking, the simple miracle of a lit lamp in the window welcoming him home. They settled into a quiet rhythm, two wounded souls circling each other with careful respect, neither willing to name the feeling growing between them, both terrified of the vulnerability that naming it would require. But peace on the frontier rarely lasted long, and trouble found its way to the Whitfield ranch the way storms find their way across open prairie, announced by distant signs that grow louder until they cannot be ignored. The trouble arrived in the form of Garrett Boone, a man whose name was spoken in Cedar Hollow only in hushed, careful tones. Boone had been among the outlaws responsible for the raid that killed Thomas's father 3 years earlier, though he had escaped justice by fleeing the territory before the sheriff could gather enough evidence to hold him. Now, emboldened by years of evading consequence, Boone had returned to Wyoming with a gang of Rough Riders, intent on claiming grazing land that bordered Thomas's property, land that rightfully belonged to honest ranchers who had worked it for generations. The first sign of danger came one evening when Thomas discovered a section of his fence torn down and several head of cattle missing, driven off under cover of darkness. Sheriff Tate, an aging lawman who had seen too much violence to act with anything but careful deliberation, warned Thomas against confronting Boone directly, reminding him that the outlaws' gang outnumbered any single rancher's resources. But Thomas carried 3 years of unresolved grief and rage, and the sight of his father's killer operating freely in the same territory lit something dangerous within him. Sarah Jane, sensing the storm building in Thomas's silence, confronted him one evening as he cleaned his father's old rifle with trembling, determined hands. She spoke to him with a fierceness that surprised them both, reminding him that vengeance had never once brought back anyone's father, that she herself had buried bitterness toward the men who failed her family only to discover that hatred consumes the one who holds it long before it ever touches its intended target. She told him, with tears she refused to let fall, that she had not survived her own hardships only to watch him destroy himself, chasing a dead man's ghost. Her words struck something true in Thomas, and for the first time since his father's death, he allowed himself to weep openly in front of another living soul, the grief he'd carried alone finally finding somewhere safe to land. Sarah Jane held him through it, not with romantic tenderness, but with the steady compassion of someone who understood that healing required witnesses, that grief shared was grief halved. But understanding alone could not stop Garrett Boone's ambitions, and within days, the conflict reached its breaking point. Boone and his gang rode openly into Cedar Hollow, intimidating shopkeepers and threatening Sheriff Tate himself, declaring that the surrounding ranch lands would soon belong to men willing to take what the law was too weak to protect. Word reached Thomas that Boone intended to burn the Whitfield Ranch entirely, finishing what he'd started 3 years before, eliminating any rancher bold enough to stand against his claims to the territory. Thomas rode into town that evening, not for vengeance alone, but with a plan born from desperation and the fragile hope Sarah Jane had helped rekindle within him. He found Sheriff Tate and convinced him that the town's scattered ranchers, if united, could finally stand against Boone's gang where individual resistance had always failed. Thomas had learned, through Sarah Jane's quiet strength, that survival sometimes required community rather than solitary courage, that asking for help was not weakness but wisdom. The ranchers gathered that night in the saloon, men who had each suffered their own losses to Boone's gang over the years, men who had grown weary of fear ruling their lives. Thomas spoke to them with newfound conviction, reminding them that justice delayed was not justice denied, that courage shared among neighbors could accomplish what courage alone could not. By the time the meeting ended, a dozen armed ranchers had committed to standing together against Boone's threatened attack, with Sheriff Tate organizing their defense with the careful precision of a man determined not to lose another life on his watch. The confrontation came 2 nights later, beneath a moon that cast pale silver light across the prairie, when Boone's gang rode toward the Whitfield Ranch expecting to find a lone, vulnerable target. Instead, they found a town's worth of armed, determined men positioned along the fence lines and rooftops, prepared to defend not just one ranch, but the principle that the frontier belonged to honest folk, not outlaws who ruled through fear. The gunfight that followed was brief but fierce, the night erupting in flashes of gunfire and shouted warnings, horses screaming and rearing in the chaos. Thomas found himself face to face with Garrett Boone amid the confusion, the man who had haunted his nightmare for 3 years, now standing close enough to recognize the same fear in his eyes that Thomas had once carried alone. But where vengeance might have once consumed him, Thomas instead disarmed Boone with controlled, deliberate force, choosing to deliver him to Sheriff Tate's justice rather than claim a darker justice of his own. It was a choice that cost him nothing yet gained him everything, freeing him finally from the chains his father's death had wrapped around his heart. Boone and his surviving gang members were arrested that night, finally facing the justice that had eluded them for years, while Cedar Hollow's ranchers celebrated a victory that belonged to community rather than any single hero. Thomas returned home in the gray light of early morning, exhausted but unburdened in a way he hadn't felt since childhood, to find Sarah Jane waiting on the porch, having spent the night praying by lamplight for his safe return. He told her everything. The confrontation, the choice he'd made, the strange peace that had settled over him in the aftermath. Sarah Jane listened with tears streaming freely down her face, finally understanding that the man before her had chosen healing over vengeance, community over isolation, and in doing so had become someone capable of building rather than merely surviving. In the weeks that followed, something tender and undeniable grew between them, no longer hidden behind careful boundaries or unspoken fears. Thomas found himself one evening, beneath a sky painted gold with sunset, kneeling before Sarah Jane Marlowe. Not as an employer offering wages, but as a man offering his whole heart, scarred and healing as it was. He spoke of how she had arrived in Cedar Hollow, believing herself abandoned and unwanted, only to become the very person who taught him that love could exist alongside grief, that second chances were not weaknesses but gifts meant to be embraced. Sarah Jane, who had learned through hardship to guard her heart fiercely, found herself unable to refuse a love so honestly offered. She accepted his proposal with tears of joy replacing the tears of grief she had carried for so long. And their wedding, held simply at the Cedar Hollow Church with the whole town in attendance, became a celebration not just of their union, but of a community's victory over fear and violence. If this story has touched your heart even a little, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from today and share with us one lesson you've carried away from Thomas and Sarah Jane's journey. Because stories like theirs remind us that grace often arrives disguised as hardship, and second chances are scattered along our paths far more often than we realize. Years later, the Whitfield Ranch stood transformed, no longer a place of lonely grief, but a thriving homestead filled with children's laughter, healthy cattle grazing across protected land, an enduring legacy of two broken souls who found wholeness in each other. Thomas often told their children, gathered around the evening fire, that he had ridden in a Cedar Hollow that long-ago day, seeking nothing more than grain for his cattle, never imagining that God had something far greater waiting for him. A woman whose courage would heal his deepest wounds, whose faith would restore his shattered hope, and whose love would transform a house of sorrow into a home filled with everlasting grace. And so, beneath that same Wyoming sky that had once witnessed his darkest grief, Thomas Whitfield discovered the truest lesson of the frontier, that kindness extended to a stranger could become the very foundation upon which an entire lifetime of love was built, and that sometimes the greatest blessings arrive not through what we go searching for, but through who we choose to help along the way. If this story stirred something within your heart, if you believe, as Thomas and Sarah Jane discovered, that kindness, faith, redemption, and second chances can transform even the most broken lives, please like, comment, share, and subscribe so more hearts can find their way to stories like this one. Thank you for riding alongside us on this journey through the Old West. And may you always remember that grace is often closer than we think, waiting patiently just beyond the next dusty road.